presenters.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, George, for getting us all into this space. I'm Dr. Rose-Anne Reynolds. I was reminded, yes, that it's very exciting to have recently graduated, so that's important. I graduated with my PhD in 2021, and Karen was my supervisor, so did some interesting work around philosophy with children. Really happy to be here today because we're going to be using the community of philosophical inquiry, which is the pedagogy of philosophy with children, to be in this community together. We're going to be, or I'll be fulfilling the role of difficultating this conversation, which comes out of, this is a book we spoke about last week, Literacy is Literature and Learning, and Joanna Haynes and Walter Cohen write about difficultating. So it's kind of like the teacher not doing what is expected of them in the school. So kind of we're going to just work together, think together, play together differently. And I know our three presenters are looking forward to getting going. I just want to say one important thing about context, and I realize, or geopolitical context. This project is funded by the National Research Foundation of South Africa, where Karen used to be based in South Africa. So they pay for George, for example, which is fantastic. But also with that comes a political difficulty for some of us who are experiencing something called load shedding, which means some of us will be in different stages of darkness in this Zoom, and some of us will be trying to join another device when we have our power go off. And it's not only our current corruption, it's apartheid corruption, it's the corruption that started during colonial times. So just to remind you that that's kind of where we are at the moment, and each of you are probably in a context that means something, and there's difficulty in there, and I think we bring that into the room. We don't try and pretend that we're all okay with that, with what could be happening. So we've had a lovely past 2 weeks, and I'm looking forward to this week, and we have 3 presenters, which is wonderful. And so we're going to start right now, and I'm going to ask our presenters to just feel free to, sorry, I've lost my screen. I'm going to find all of you in a minute. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'll just switch that off. So either Anna.
I didn't catch that. Could you try again?
Oh my gosh, that's Siri picking up this. I'm sorry about that.
Sure, I understand.
Oh my goodness.
Try
the more than human.
Siri wants to join us. Talk about ChatGPT and AI. It's all thanks, Siri. We're fine. So either Anna or Mari or Ruth, I'm going to allow you to introduce yourselves in this first question, which was quite intentional. So I'm going to read the question for all of you and then ask one of you to go first. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself briefly by sharing one example from your PhD process, which expresses what worked in terms of supervision, your research, or for you as a PhD student, and then ending that introduction with a question that you have formulated. George will capture those questions. And certainly in your introduction, please don't forget to introduce yourself in terms of your name and your surname and where you are located. Thanks. So Ruth, would you like to go first on my screen?
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Rose-Anne. That's brilliant. And thank you everyone for having me here. I'm Ruth Churchill Dower. I'm a PhD student at Manchester Metropolitan University in the north of England. It is actually sunny here today, which is one of the few days of the year we get sunshine, and it's wonderful. So that's good. So focusing on the intimate reciprocities of not speaking, I've been exploring how the modes of somatic and haptic expression in young children who don't always speak can become seen, felt and heard through entanglements with material and sensory oddkin, where, as Haraway says, companion species infect each other all the time. And the fact that connection proceeds via contagion, affect and epidemic, rather than by meaning and signification, is how language is freed from its representational function and mobilizes sensations and affects, which is something that Maggie McClure wrote a lot about. And Maggie was my first supervisor before she retired, so she naturally had some influence over my thinking. And this has given rise to a speculative method that I've been working with called body listening as an alternative modality for children who aren't always able to speak. So through the affective mode of contact improvisation, we found ways of opening to the most minor movements, sometimes appearing simply to stand, to be in a space together apart, but nonetheless hearing the cracks and creaks of the muscles and fascia in our bodies as they adapted to the many tiny movements, responding to forces of gravity, balance and momentum, as much as their affective and virtual entanglements. And it's reminded us that bodies, histories and potentialities are constantly falling through gravity and diffracting as they materialize as part of the sensorial knowledges being woven in becoming with the world. So I wanted to introduce this concept of the imperceptible, the affective movements, and how we might consider the infrathin to show up. And the infrathin is what Duchamp called a quality of the in-between, or as Manning expresses, an interval too thin to define as such, and yet thick with the texture of lived relation. An affective encounter that cannot be articulated or anticipated. It can only be known after the fact, when grasping for the sense of not simply identifying the difference, but, as Barad says, what makes the difference. So these are the markings of what Manning calls minor socialities that contribute to some kind of collective conversation without requiring spoken knowledge. And as my research thinks with these intersectional modes of dance, video, violin, material, child, it prompts questions as to what are the qualities of this improvisational movement, these imperceptible touches that facilitate such infrathin encounters. And I would say it's often nothing more than a proximity, a willingness to prehend other modes of existence and an openness to subvert the familiar, the typical, the normative categorizations within which bodies are held against their will. So it's kind of an attunement not to human relationships, but to the more than human, the felt effects that are more than the sum of their parts, the playful agreements, the weatheredness and the smoothness of careful and curious palms, the invisible and illegible transmissions of biologies, bacteria, ancestral histories, smiley eyes or sweat molecules, and the enjoyment of these minor socialities which foreground our major matters of concern. So as we grappled with these infrathin sensations during our supervision sessions, my two supervisors and I wondered how to talk about this data that defies orthodox modalities without simplifying it to familiar human analyses. And I'll talk about that maybe a little bit more when we move on to the supervisor session. But in terms of returning right now, my research has been heavily influenced by Baradian posthumanism and speculative post-qualitative methodologies. And I found these to be both new and yet not new at the same time. Agential realism and the interaction of materialization as an ongoing iterative reconfiguration of doing, knowing, being, sensing seems to make perfect sense of everything I've been striving to practice before coming to study at PhD level, i.e. everything that I've seen children doing, being, knowing and sensing is so interactive. Now I can hardly believe that I ever thought that, we could ever separate knowledge and being. So going far beyond the humanist notion of everything centering around the child and keeping the child in this fixed position of responsibility for changing their world and all that's wrong with it, this is a particularly potent area in terms of physical and mental health, where children are considered lacking, faulty, troublesome, even abnormal, and their parents are held responsible to try and fix what is wrong with them. Well, in my practice, I've been working with children with what's called selective mutism, where they can only speak in very familiar environments. And in my practice, working with contact improvisation, a form of dance, not talking is not a problem, and therefore talking is not the solution. But this idea presents me with a huge challenge to support families to think interactively and with not speaking, with movement and with bodies and with those imperceptible areas of touch, to think beyond selective mutism as a label, when in fact this diagnosis is actually the very thing that opens doors for them to support, albeit pathologized and reductive and colonialist support. It is still very important for them to have that. So my question, moving on to that, I found that there's a constant friction between humanist and post-humanist worldings with regards to how my research and practice can become intertwined. And my research aims to practice this ethics of care with post-colonial, post-human, post-qualitative worldings by trying to resist prescribing identitarian categories or this sort of Cartesian framed research as the majoritarian factor, especially whilst working with young children and families whose bodies have always already been othered. So my question is, how can post-qualitative research be discussed or experienced, shall we say, in accessible ways that don't already alienate the other?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ruth. That was great. I know George is going to ask you to repeat your question if you don't mind. So maybe you could just do that for her time.
Of course. How can post-qualitative research be experienced in accessible ways that do not already alienate the other?
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. Wow, that was yeah, I've written a lot already. Thank you. So I'm not going to say any more because I'm going to allow either Maria or Anna. Would either of you like to go next, or Marie, would you like to go? Okay, thanks. I'll ask you. Thanks so much. Thank you, Ruth. We'll hear the same. Are you happy? Do you want me to repeat the question, Marie, or are you fine?
I think I'm fine.
Good.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah.
My computer is making quite a bit of a noise in my end. Is it bothering you?
No.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm very newly graduated. I completed my PhD on Thursday. And I'm going to talk a bit about, first I will present myself, and then I will talk a bit about trust and quality in post-qualitative work, because I'm a violin teacher, and I've been teaching violin through the process of doing this research project. I'm located in Oslo in Norway, and I did my PhD at the Norwegian Academy of Music. And Norway is a very small country, and music is a small field. And when I started, I didn't even know the word posthumanism. It was kind of not a part of the world I knew at all. And by some accidents and some readings, I stumbled across Karen Barad. And this was half a year into my project period. And I remember coming to my supervisor and said, this is the thing, this is what I'm going to do. And she said, okay, then we'll do that. And she had no idea what she was agreeing to do. And she did it, we've talked about it later, and she did it out of kind of trust. She trusted that my gut instinct, my kind of enthusiasm would be generative, although she didn't have the knowledge to assess the theory. And she also trusted my ability to learn a new and complex theory and her ability to learn it alongside me. So there was a huge element in trust in that transformation from social constructivist thinking and theory to posthumanist. It was a leap of faith almost. So when I've been doing this process, first I came across Karen Barad, and then I learned about Post-Qualitative Inquiry, and I read Elizabeth St. Pierre, and she's writing of trust, trusting the process, trusting the readings, trusting the philosophy. And my question is about the duality or the conflict even maybe between trusting the process, trusting that what you do not know how to do will become something interesting and worthwhile, while also being a PhD student that will be assessed and that will kind of have to conform to the institution you're working at, the field of research you're working within. So my question is, how do we talk about and assess quality in, or maybe more the qualities of, post-qualitative work?
Thanks, Mari. George, would you like that again? Maybe just repeat that again, please, Mari.
How do we talk about and assess quality in, or maybe the qualities of, post-qualitative work?
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. Wow. So we've got, we're moving from, thank you, from Ruth to Mari to Anna. Anna, thank you so much, Mari, for that. I'm restraining myself just for the record.
It's really difficult to follow those two. Would you mind if I had sharing
Yeah, George will
permission, please?
Always.
Thank you, just because it helps me to, what's the word, structure my own thoughts. So can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you. Let me just go from, okay. So I'm going to start my my section just talking a little bit about my background and the context of the research before explaining why I don't call myself a post-qualitative inquirer yet. And this is partly why I want to join in these discussions, because as I explained to the difficultators at the start, I am neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult, and I'm still kind of processing that and what that means for my understandings of myself and the world. And I think sometimes when I try and define something, I can get very fixed on what it means in one way. So that's why it's really important to hear from other people. And what was really sort of affective for me today was hearing how Ruth was talking about her work as a practitioner with young people, because that's where I'm coming from. So my name's Anna Pilson. I'm studying at the University of Durham. I'm supposed to finish later this year. I also work full-time at the University of Birmingham now. And my job prior to my PhD and until last year was I was a vision impairment teacher. And my role was to basically go to different settings and advise what worked, what was effective to ensure access to the curriculum and inclusion for visually impaired children. And I thought I was quite good at my job. And then one day I was in a lesson and I realized, I walked into the classroom and I spoke to the teacher, and the teacher said to me, "Oh, Anna, I went to your training session last night and I did X, Y, Z to make this piece of work accessible for the pupil. I adapted it in this way." And I felt so proud of myself. I was like, oh, I'm doing my job so well. And then I turned around and I saw the young man sitting in his desk, not involved in the conversation at all. But the worst thing was he had no idea that he could be involved in the conversation. And it was like sort of almost a glow moment, as we would take from Maggie McClure. But also I was very interested in Rice et al.'s expression of interference, constructive interference, but also destructive interference. And that moment almost sort of stopped me in my tracks. And I was like, okay, so I am trying to do this job in which I've got the best interests, I feel, of the young people at heart, but actually all I'm doing is funneling them into these normative systems. So when I got the the prompt for today's speaking, it said what worked in your PhD, and I'm not quite finished, so I guess what works, and we had to introduce ourselves, but I would like to do to that question what I have kind of done to my conceptualization of education, which is change that question to what matters, because I think there's a lot of research, conventional qualitative research, humanistic research, that focuses on this sort of evidence-based research, impact-based research, what matters, what's effective, and what works and what's effective. But actually, there's not a lot of research that focuses on what matters to the young people that educators and practitioners are working with. And essentially, when I realized after the sort of interruption of the pandemic, that what I was doing was kind of still trying to force these children into these very, it's almost like funneling them into this normative pathway of expectations of success. Like, what is success in the UK education system? It is achieving exam results and being able to move on to the next phase of your life that allows you to become a productive economic citizen. But I think currently we are maybe trying to mold our young people towards a future that probably doesn't exist anymore. You know, thinking of the context, the rise of the right in the sort of West, global warming, the pandemic. How can we be focusing on what works when we don't even know what the future's going to be? I know that's like a big question, but basically my project asks visually impaired children what matters to them, and through that we as practitioners can find out things that can influence our own practice in ways that we might not expect. And why should we find out? Because of the context now, and where might this lead us? I'm getting onto that in my research, but I just wanted to mention about the pandemic and why it's important, and then I will stop talking, I promise, and get onto my question. But there's the great book that's just come out this year on the writing and articulation of post-qualitative research. I'm not sponsored, but it's great. And Kelly Guillot in this book talks about writing through disturbance. And I think that's what we've all been doing. We've been researching through disturbance. And as Rose-Anne said at the start, we've all experienced difficulties in different ways. And the pandemic certainly hasn't been a leveler. It's exposed existing inequality and inequity, and it's also engendered plenty of it. And just again, coming from my perspective as a PhD student, coming into the last sort of 6 months of study, I need to be choosing external examiners. I need to be doing all this that we do in the UK system. And my supervisor said to me, nobody cares anymore about the pandemic, just put a statement and ignore it. It's over. And that really jarred with me in many ways, and I tweeted about it and it went a little bit viral. And it turns out that a lot of people think that the pandemic is still really important, but this has been my issue with post-qualitative research, and it was expressed really well, I think, in a special edition that came out in 2022, and it's Jennifer Volgemuth et al. They sort of talk about where's the social justice orientation of post-qualitative research, and I think it's really there, but also sometimes I don't think it's overt enough. So this is why I've been sort of straddling the hyphen between conventional qualitative and post-qualitative research. But I think that's okay, because Brian Masumi says we can start in the middle. So I'm literally standing in the middle of those kind of paradigmatic stances. But just to skip on, oh, that's the wrong one. That's my end of my thing. So this is my question, and I'll put it in the chat. So what does it mean to do post-qualitative inquiry now? And kind of how has writing through disturbance affected your thinking, doing and research? And I'm aware, sorry, that's two parts to the question, but I just think that, you know, we talk about being PhD students and the problems that we have, and obviously Ruth's got excellent supervision, and it sounded like Mari had really good supervision as well. And this is not a personal kind of criticism of my supervisors at all, they're great, but it's that acceptance in some institutions of post-qualitative research and inquiry that I don't know if I'm struggling with it because I'm so entrenched in those kind of conventional research patterns. So why is post-qualitative inquiry now important now as well in the pandemic context?
Thank you so much, Anna. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn it the other way around, just because you just finished talking. I think we'll start with Anna's question and offer that to Marie and to Ruth to start. So we're going to first let our participants, our presenters, sorry, share their responses with each other, and then we'll open that up to everybody else who's here. So Ruth or Marie, whoever would like to go first. The question that Anna has just asked us is, what does it mean to do post-qualitative inquiry now? And then how has writing through disturbance affected your thinking, doing research? I'll wait for a sign. Ruth's unmuted herself, as well as Mari.
Mari, do you want to speak first? I'm happy to go if not. Okay, I'll go. Yeah, lovely question. Thank you so much, Anna, for that. That's it's beautifully contextualized as well. And I think one thing that really struck me during the pandemic, because I had to reconfigure all of my fieldwork, which was all set up to take place in a special educational needs school. All the training had been done with teachers, with parents, the children. We'd gone through all the consent processes and so on. And bam, lockdown happens. No professionals in the UK or non-professionals were allowed in schools except the ones being paid to be there. So I had to start all of that again. And I ended up working directly through Zoom with families with children that don't speak. And what was really incredible was that the pandemic allowed this fieldwork to take place in people's homes in a way that I would never otherwise have had access to as a researcher, and with families who were so keen to be part of the research, because my premise was that the children did not need to talk. They were absolutely fine not talking. That was my preferred way of being with them. And every other professional in these families' lives had said, we must get your child talking. We've got to narrow the gap of not talking and blah, 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 which was a very frightening existence to be in that situation for them. And fast forward a number of months where I was working with these children through dance, movement, contact improvisation, through music, violin and so forth. And 5 out of the 6 children started speaking quite fluently and openly with me, first of all through Zoom, and then when the lockdown was lifted, we were able to meet together in an art gallery, and the talking continued. And the adults shut up, we stopped talking, and the space was open for the children to express with their bodies, with some kinds of sounds and articulations and so on, in any which way they preferred. And there were many, many beautiful moments, and with us adults sometimes in tears because of the affect and the effectiveness of what was happening here. It's not rocket science, but I can thankfully say that the pandemic had an incredible impact and is having an ongoing impact on the research. We're still in touch with those families, and those children have now started school and gone into situations where they're happy to move with their bodies and to express things with their bodies, and the families are happy to discuss this with the teachers, that bodily communication is just as important and just as valid and valued. And that, I think those children may have a very different experience of selective mutism than perhaps some other children who are in more pathologized situations. So.
Thank you, Ruth. I mean, these are such interesting perspectives from, which is the gift of this opportunity to hear what happened for you in that space and for those particular children. Thank you. Marie, thank you.
Oh, that was wonderful to hear about, because yeah, I have some experience with selective mutism and music, and to express yourself is kind of a difficult thing anyways, but if you have other ways of expressing, you might find them. And the pandemic for me happened 2/3 into my period of observations of violin lessons. So I was about to start the 3rd period, and then everything shut down. So I had 2 periods with face-to-face lessons and 1 period of online lessons to work with when I started to kind of not analyzing, but working with my empirical engagements. And for me, the online violin lessons changed everything. It really changed how I was thinking about the face-to-face lessons as well, because I'd been reading Barad, and I had been reading about topological notion of space and time, and I had read the things they write, but I hadn't lived them or been kind of forced to understand the impact of the writing. But all of a sudden I was doing and observing violin lessons from my bedroom into someone else's living room via a Zoom room, and my idea of where a violin lesson were held was kind of poof. So I don't know where violin lessons are held anymore. I had to rethink all of that, and I had to rethink it in terms of the boundaries as becoming through interactions. I had read the sentence, but I hadn't understood it before I was experiencing it in a new way. And then I returned to the observations of face-to-face lessons, and I realized that there were boundary making interactions happening there as well, but I didn't notice them in the same way the first time around. So for me, kind of the pandemic and that disturbance also had effect on what had happened previously, but not previously because the past is never left behind. So that's one aspect of it. And also I think the pandemic, in some ways, it opened up a great space, like the reading groups and these kind of events. I think maybe they were happening before, but I didn't know of them, but it opened up a huge space for discussion across borders and across time zones that were not available to me before. And the pandemic shut down my thinking in many ways as well. There were periods of a lot of anxiety and dread, and it's very difficult to explain, but I know you all experienced that feeling of losing your grip of the world, maybe. It was so. I also had long periods where I was too afraid to think anything new, I think. But that was also, it wasn't fun, but it was a learning experience, I could say. Yeah, so I think that the disturbance of the pandemic really has disturbed me in many ways that will continue to be working in the future as well.
Thank you, Marie. I mean, I can just resonate, literally resonate with what you're saying. When you think about what does it mean to do post-qualitative inquiry, we can take out the how and just say, take out the now and just say how, because there isn't past, and it's, as you're saying, and your comment about when you went back, you could see how the pandemic has also influenced what had happened before, because there isn't a before, there isn't an after. So having that response to you, Anna, is quite interesting about, well, it's not over, and has it actually even begun? I mean, that's, so thank you, Mari. Anna, so what we're going to do now, because keeping track of everything, because you asked that question, we're going to go to Mari's question now, and then I'll ask you to answer that and Ruth to answer that, please. Unless you wanted to comment on your own question, Anna.
I do, but I think I'll take too long. But it was just very, very, very useful to me to hear other people having similar experiences, put it that way, because my participants, when we talked about what mattered to them, the pandemic mattered hugely. Like, you know, they were talking about not, you know, some of them were bothered about missing their exams, but a lot of them were talking about, oh, I've missed my prom. You know, these things that we wouldn't, as teachers and adults, necessarily think were that important were huge to them, particularly in that liminal space where like Mari said, you might lose your sort of grip on life, and you know, so yeah. And can I just double check that Mari's question was how?
Yes,
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
So Mari was asking, how do we talk about and assess quality in or qualities of post-qualitative work?
Would you like me to go first, Ruth, or would you like to go? Okay. Well, this is actually a question that's at the heart of what I'm doing now, because I'm finding it really difficult to justify sort of changing the focus of my PhD towards a more post-qualitative bent, as it were. I think the beauty of post-qualitative research in its expansiveness is also what's really frightening to institutions, because, you know, before I even understood that sort of post-qualitative research was a thing, I didn't see how ethics, ontology and epistemology could be separated. That did not make sense to me at all. And then when I read about ethico-onto-epistemology, I was like, oh, right, okay, so other people think like that. And I think that that's what's been happening my whole journey, is finding that other people think in different ways. And I think it's interesting what Erin Manning says about neurodiversity, and I think maybe my brain and its natural state of ADHD, it automatically diffracts things and attunes to the effective. But basically, I find that question really hard to answer, because I think that quality for me, if I had to try and distill it, me, is that thinking with theory, and that I don't think you can, like Sarah Ahmed has a brilliant quote where she talks about when she's doing a PhD, people are asking her, you know, are you a Derridian, are you a Lacanian, you know, and she says no to those, and then they say, well, if not, what? And then she says, well, if not, not. And she says that she can't set her stand with, you know, people whose life experience don't necessarily reflect her own. So it was like old white men, basically, in her case. And I think for me, quality in post-qualitative research shows that we engage with a range of theories, and not just the names that pop up in a systematic literature review if we put in you know, keyword searches. I think they've got to be more expansive. And I think, going back to Sarah Ahmed again, she says citation is a feminist memory, and I think that helps us judge quality in post-qualitative research. Is the research engaging with a range of, I think, what Matsai and Jackson call out of field voices. So thinking about voice as not just constituted through what comes out in speech, and not just constituted as from the individual, but what's constituted relationally in our interactions with, other agents, human and non. So I think in my thesis, I have talked a lot about a lot of my sort of theoretical literature engagements aren't just from books and journal articles, and they're not, what the things that have helped me understand are going back to Kathleen Stewart, can be those ordinary things that affect you. So I think for me, quality and post-qualitative research is an engagement with an array of literature, or an array of sources, shall we say.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks. I know it's difficult to, it is always difficult anyway to stop ourselves, because as we're talking, we're generating even more talking. So Ruth looks like she's about to jump out of her screen to share. And I know, thank you to our audience who's been, well, you're not audience, you are participating in your bodies, in your facial expressions, but this is we have 3 participants today, which is lovely. 3 presenters, I keep mixing them all up. So Ruth, you may chat.
Thank you. I don't know about jumping out of my screen. That sounds fantastic. So maybe I'll do some jumping in a bit. I think my response to Mari's lovely question is to kind of throw it back and say, well, what is quality? And how does our speculative and processual work become qualified in its never-endingness? And I would say that on the one hand, we don't need it. We don't need this qualification of everything that we are so obsessed with in both the arts and the education sectors. But on the other hand, we do need it because we need to protect those boundary making practices that happen for each collaboration. And I guess for me, the issue is how we decouple the terminology and the process of quality from its sort of identitarian categories that are aligned with more colonialist thinking and more reductive thinking. And this is kind of where I get a bit concerned about Baradian agential realism, because when I'm really curious about the agential cut, I start to think, well, what happens to everyone and everything that gets excluded from the cut, in these kind of amazing exclusion zones? Is that matter still materializing in some kind of left field exclusion zone? Or does that possibility or that materiality that's been excluded from the cut simply cease to exist, with everything that existed before the cut being acknowledged in the history of the phenomena that actually takes place? And perhaps it is being, kept alive in a history that's ready for another future or another reconfiguration or another excluded cut in the world. But I can't help but thinking, actually, much as I absolutely love a lot of Barad's work, what they perhaps don't resolve for me, and this is, I'm sure, deliberate, is this sense of, the idea of what happens to the excluded and those that, human and non-human, that can't fight for themselves or that can't try somehow to squash these identitarian politics around quality and the fact that they're excluded from that, or that they're considered to be lacking somehow, abnormal somehow, not good enough, not enough. So yeah, I think that's my both my thoughts and also my concern about the potential romanticism of agential realism, where the reality is really very different for those who just are not able to fight individualism when individualism isn't prepared to give up its own power.
Thank you, Ruth. Mari, are you interested, or would you like to just make a comment about your own question? And then I'm going to actually open up this part to the rest of the group before we move on to Ruth's question, just to let some other voices and spaces happen. Mari, would you like to comment?
Oh, I really enjoyed your answers, and thank you. It's a question that I'm pondering as well.
Yeah, and I think maybe a way to think about the question is not that we need to find answers today, but just to keep grappling with it and maybe develop more questions. So I'm going to ask all the others of us in the Zoom room. There's been a lot to think about, think with and through. Would anybody like to maybe make a comment now or raise another question in response to these questions before we return to Ruth's question? And we may need 30 seconds to just think a little. Okay, I welcome any comments from anyone in the in the space.
I'm good, thanks.
Thank you.
I'm in a Zoom at the moment. Dr. Parr.
George, can you mute? Thank you. Thanks so much. Shame, we all have done that. If people don't want to, are we happy to just carry on with, we'll go back to, yeah, let's go back to Ruth's question. I just want to make sure we are getting each other's space. So Anna, you or Mari can answer Ruth's question, and I'll just scroll up to that. It was, how can post-qualitative research be experienced in accessible ways that don't already alienate the other? Which you sort of alluded to in your response, Ruth, to Mari's question. Thanks. Okay. Mari, do you want to go?
Yeah. It's a tough one.
Yeah. They're all tough. Yeah, this is
How can post-qual research be experienced in accessible ways? Because accessibility is kind of a new field to me, and I've been thinking about it more and more recently. And one of the things I've been noticing is that accessibility might not be the same for everyone, and accessibility should not be a single thing. It's a multitude of ways of accessing for different people in different ways, and also for different non-humans. So just to use my own research as an example, I wrote in English, while participants of my study was Norwegian teachers and students. So my research is accessible for the teachers who participated, but not for the children. And that is not something I'm happy about. But if I were to write in Norwegian, I couldn't have this conversation and be a part of the broader field of post-human research and post-human educational research. So in choosing my language, I chose accessibility for some and not for others. And that is not an easy decision. But I did it, and I excluded the children from having the possibility of commenting and reading and participating in my written versions of their lives, actually, because I write stories from violin lessons, and the teachers read the stories, but not the children. So kind of my response is that accessibility is something we must be responsible for how we do. Maybe we can, at least in the considerations I've made, I've excluded in making it accessible for some, I exclude others. And that is, maybe it's not possible to avoid, but I have to know that I'm doing it and not just do it on like an automatic without considering the implications. Sure. So that's my response, I think.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks very much, Mari. Anna, do you need me to repeat the question, or you?
No, I'm okay, thank you. And I thought that was really powerful, because I think that is something that we all wrestle with as researchers and practitioners, particularly because we all have sort of these different situated knowledge and experience, to go back to sort of more humanistic ideas. And I think as well that quite often the context that I'm working in, so in the UK we call the special educational needs and disability SEND. There's laws about how accessibility should be sort of implemented for children who don't necessarily fit the Vitruvian ideal of, you know, the human. And so I think we're always trying to navigate these really violent systems. And before the PhD started and before the pandemic, I realized that I was unwittingly kind of doing this in my job. Was like I was trying to fight the system, but I was still almost reifying the system at the same time. And then when I came to my PhD, I was wanting to do participatory action research, and like Ruth, I think I had my fieldwork arranged. I was about to go into a school to do a participatory action research project with children, and it was going to be like this, and I was going to be the, you know, the adult white savior who comes in and, you know, sorts everything out and listens to the children's voices and empowers and all this. And then, you know, I look back at it now and I'm sort of cringing because I didn't understand. And now that I do understand, like now that I view the world differently because I've come to the posts, as it were, I think that sometimes we don't need to do these massive projects that we think are going to sort of shock that macro systemic, those violent systems that we're in. Sometimes actually it's just those tiny micro political acts of resistance that can be the most powerful. Because I spent a long time thinking, well, any research I do now is going to be, you know, not as emancipatory or transformative and all these things, you know. And then actually as I did what St. Pierre says, and I read, I started to understand theory differently. And then I realized it's actually what you underpin your research with rather than specifically how you do it that matters. So I've sort of framed my ethical anthropistemology that's framing my whole PhD. I've called it radical love, and radical not as in like, you know, radical man, but like radical is in the plant radical, because actually Deleuze and Guattari say that the radical can start rhizomatic growth. And so, but I also think that it's an anchoring presence, and I think love is what anchors post-qualitative research and can make it accessible. Because if your orientation, your theoretical and philosophical orientations are infused with, you know, a sense of love and care, then I do think that even if you use a method like, you know, I ended up doing interviews over Zoom, and that was like, I did not want to do that. I wanted to radically disrupt normative times and spaces of schools by going in and doing this, that, and the other. But actually, all I did was I reframed the interview as an interview, and instead of talking to children and asking what I wanted to hear and learn about, I let them, I know that sounds awful, I let them, but I am still the adult. I've automatically got this power and I can't quite devolve it, but they spoke about what mattered to them. And it wasn't just what they were talking about. We actually brought in objects and thing power, and they became conversations with a purposeful entanglement, as Man and Volgamuth call it. And one of the students said to me, "You are the only adult who has spoken to me about what the pandemic has been like. Thank you." And those conversations, those little spaces of time, can actually be so much more powerful than we think, and more accessible. So I think it's actually, you know, if we recreate our research each time for each project, it's just about being sure that our underpinnings are accessible, I guess.
Sure, thank you, Anna. Well, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, we can feel the saturation of all these thoughts and different ideas, which is fantastic, just swimming through this space. We have a question from Joanne, and maybe I could just ask the three presenters. Presenters does sound like a strange word. I mean, we're not trying to present, so the three participants who are speaking more than everyone else today, to share the title of your PhD, please, and then maybe just, if you could just, Ruth, do you want to tell us the time? I mean, I know as PhD students, we sometimes have to look them up because we need to be reminded, but Ruth, do you want to just share? I know you put it in the group, but maybe to say it for the recording, and then Mari, and then Anna, please.
Okay, my title of my PhD is Bodies of Difference. Can movement improvisation help us attune to the sensory expressions of young children who sometimes do not speak?
Thank you. And then Mari, thank you for popping in your, and Ruth, you're welcome to share yours too if you'd like, but Mari, do you want to give us your title, please?
Yeah, my dissertation is titled Knots of Knowing in Playing, Stories from Violin Lessons Read Diffractally Through a Gentle Realism.
Thank you. And Anna, do you want to read yours? Well, it's a title in progress.
Yeah, it doesn't have a title, but it's basically what matters to visually impaired young people. How can we find out? Why should we find out? And where might this lead us in education and research?
Right, and that's leading us to our next question, but I'm going to pause here and just see, for those of us who are learning from the three of you today and being challenged by what you've suggested, is there a comment in the group? We've got another 20 minutes, but we also have 2 more questions that we'd like to get to. But I'd like to open this up now. Does anyone in the rest of the room want to ask something, contribute to a provocation that's been shared already?
Maybe. So many thoughts and feelings, actually, such rich presentations, and wow, what a scope, and what an importance actually of the research that you're all doing, and such the way, I mean, as if we planned it. Yes, we've planned it to have the three of you together. It's amazing. And I suppose my question that I'm now left with is, for all three comments, is about the kind of concern about inclusion, about access, about and I wonder, if we start differently, you end up in a different place. I don't know whether that makes sense, but I suppose the critique that Bharad gets a lot is that it's not political, and I think, or not political enough. And I think it maybe is the case if we start from the subject, and if we start with identity. So if each time, and I'm just, some of the comments jumped out for me about the use of adult and child in the conversation, and about, yeah, I'm not quite sure how to formulate this, but it is almost as if we're still working with kind of bounded subjects and bounded objects. And so if we start somewhere else and say, well, what are, as soon as we even, look or work with data or are in research sites, whatever, we can problematize that too. If we take away the boundedness of those spaces, including our own space, our body as a space, then what are the other questions that emerge? And I think Bharat will be the first one to say, what is it that we already assume as given in terms of binaries? And so what would happen if we question the use of adult, child, of subject, object? How do we think differently about a concept such as access, about a concept such as exclusion and inclusion, and who is including and who is excluding? You know, even, is it that when we even ask that question, isn't it that we already think that it is up to us to include and exclude and give the human quite a bit of power, and we're doing that ourselves, right? So that's what Bharat would say. I don't know, probably just chuck this up in the air. And I don't know whether that's helpful comment.
Yeah, very helpful, Karen, I think. Any of the respondents, you're welcome to respond to Karen's question or not. I mean, you don't have to. And anybody else in the room would like to build on that or agree or disagree. That's completely fine. Silence is the most difficult thing on Zoom, but it is important.
No. The most difficult thing is not having videos. Believe you me, I've just taught a course with only names. No, that's the worst.
I'd like to break. I'm happy to break the silence. Just to express appreciation for 3 researchers in their different journeys of PhD research, sharing in a space like this. I want to acknowledge the intensity of it, and thank you for being deliberate about speaking from your work. And I think that was why I'd asked for the titles again, because it did come across that there was a situatedness and a sort of what would be the right word? A sense of belonging with the interests that you come with into your project. So thank you for that. It's just being a PhD candidate. I'm working on my PhD, and I would like to just comment on what I picked up across the 3 presentations was that there was a lot of scope of literature and engagement with what are the ways in which research is done, or notions of research methodologies and inquiries and qualitative, post-qualitative. And so there was lots of scholars were brought into the Zoom, and I felt that there was a lot of exploration that was going on for your research to generate the kinds of questions that you still have, or the arguments that you are making. It was just by listening that I was curious about the thread of violin, music, sound, voice, sensory, sensorial, and I wondered whether just considerations around speaking about the other, or the exclusions and inclusions. What are the ideas about human exceptionalism and decentering the human in ways that allow for more attunement to what else is going on in the research endeavors. So, listening to Ruth speak about doing these field works in Zoom, which was in the home. There was, your dialogue was about how the children were doing things differently, how the families were doing things differently. But I also wondered about the affordances, or what was the furniture doing differently, or I don't know, the sound for you, Mari, as well, of violin lessons and the sounds of how did sounds work, and I don't know if I'm just wandering around this this inquiry where I think the tension for me is that we're involved in early childhood research, and so we do speak about how we can think differently about child and childhoods. But I still feel like wondering if there's maybe one very short example of how repositioning or thinking relationally, in what ways do your methodologies or even your analysis draw in the more than human to follow how to think differently about the child as a subject or in early childhood?
I could share one example from there was this girl, a very talented violin student, and her teacher, and they were having a Zoom lesson, and the student was about to play a scale, and she was asked to play it with a windy kind of sound, and she started and she froze, and she said, "It's a spider." And there was a spider in her dad's bedroom where she was, and it was not a spider in the teacher's living room where she was, and it was not a spider in my room, but the spider was still there in the violin lesson. And that spider kind of took part in her playing, because she was perfectly capable of playing a windy scale with no spider in the room. But with a spider, she was tense and her coordination was off, and she couldn't play like she normally could. And there was so many interesting affects and relations working across those three different places, and a shared space as well. And the spider took part in her playing, and it took part in the teacher's teaching, and slowly her ability to play windy came kind of back, but not in the same way, because she was still tense. And there are so many, I'm sure everybody who's been teaching kids know that these things happen. But for me, it was great to have a methodology and a theory that allowed them to happen, and that didn't separate that spider from that girl, from that sound from my space, because I'm really afraid of spiders. And my feeling was gratitude. It's not here. And those feelings came back every time I revisit this story, because of course I wrote so many iterations of it, and the feelings came with me every time. So yeah.
So Mari, was it the spider was in her imagination, or it was in the other room?
It was in the room where the violin student was, but as it was a Zoom lesson, it was not in my room.
Oh, okay. It was, oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
So I never saw the spider, but I could hear it in her voice and her way of playing.
But there could also be spiders in the imagination that are part of the interaction, right?
And the crazy thing is that one of the times I was writing this story, there was a spider at my desk.
It's interesting to think about my room and the Zoom room, because are we in separate rooms or are we in one room? Because we're making that distinction that it's not one room, because now we are, I mean, I'm asking this as a question because, yeah, I mean, who made made the rooms.
So, Karen, I want to ask a question. You were saying there's nothing worse than Zoom without video. So I want to know from Anna how Zoom is experienced by visually impaired participants or interactants. They don't experience it, I would imagine, the same way as we do. It might be a bit like for you, Karen, when the video is off.
Thank you, Hilary. I think I can't, again, answer for every young person, but only 2 of the young people chose to have their cameras on. And I don't know if this was, I don't know if this is related, but both of them had some sight. The other participants who didn't have their cameras on tended to have lower vision, as we'd call it, but I don't know if that is related. So for me, I really like seeing people with cameras on, but I don't always like to have my camera on. And so when I'm in meetings with my students in my day job, I never ask for cameras on, because I know that actually for some people that sense of performance being on is really difficult. So I think what was nice in a way was when we were having those conversations, they became really quite deep, I would say, like emotionally resonant for all of us, because we were interacting with each other, and there was a lot of affective things. And I talk about a lot of things in my thesis when, you know, again, I don't know if this is because of how ADHD impacts the way my brain works, but I am very affected by those sort of minor things, ordinary effects. So I think sometimes when we were talking with the Zoom, it almost felt like the pressure was off in a way for all of us, I think, because that was something that we had in common, because you didn't have the physical object of the phone held up next to your ear. You're in your personal space, your bedroom, your dining room, whatever, and you can share sort of as much of that as you want. So I also wondered whether having the camera off was a bit of a protective mechanism, because it stops inviting me totally in. Like I've taken the blur off on the back of my background, so you can all see I've got my son's curtains up with black cats on them, because we've not long moved house and they were the only curtains that I had. And you might be making sort of judgments about me, or not, you know, you might be thinking, is she obsessed with cats or something, you know? So I don't know whether with the students, I don't know what the power of the Zoom was, but what I do know is that I do feel like the Zoom brought us into one liminal space. We didn't feel separated. It felt like we were there with each other. And I wonder again if that's a pandemic context, because we were so physically separated from each other anyway, that became more powerful and effective during that time. So I don't really know how to answer that, because I don't have the sort of lived experience myself of being visually impaired. So, but it is something for me to think about, is that what was that role of Zoom, and would it be different with sighted participants? I don't know, but it's a really interesting question. A lot to think about. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Anna. I see Ruth's got her hand. Ruth, thank you, Hilary, too.
Thank you so much for those discussions, Anna and Hilary and Mari and Karen, because I just think that this is so relevant and so much at the nub of everything that that we're trying to grapple with in posthumanism, in terms of moving from that kind of humanist to post-humanist thinking. And yet it's so hard to tease this out of us, to let go of old ways of thinking, of doing, of being, and so on. And I think I wanted to offer an example of this, but before that I will say that although I have put my PhD question in the chat, the actual question has shifted for me recently, both radically and subtly, from the position of you know, what does movement do with a child that maybe doesn't speak sometimes, to what happens in movement when bodies express beyond words. And it's really trying to explore more about how movement animates non-lingual, non-human and human matter, and how this helps us think with the transmaterial or the transcorporeal forms of expression. And I realized that in my original title, even the label of selective mutism or the word child brings such a human-centered politics into the thinking about the research. And that's not where I'm trying to go with it. And so I wanted to offer an example using that liminal space of Zoom, as Anna so beautifully described it, which is that because I was working with very young children, they had no concept, as it were, of where their bodies were in relation to the camera on the screen. So very often you would see bit parts of bodies in movement, in response ability in the situations that we were in. And one occasion happened where we were playing with a sock puppet that we had made together over Zoom. I'd sent all the materials in advance to the families in a suitcase with closed envelopes for each session. And during each session, we would open the envelope, discover what was inside, and then make something together. And it was something that would enable movement without words. So in this occasion, we made a sock puppet called Sock-a-Doodle-Doo. And I played my violin, and the children in their individual sessions moved in ways that they felt they wanted to move, or moved their sock-a-doodle-doo sock puppet. And in one particular instance, the boy was not actually on the screen, but his body was jumping up and down, and I wasn't playing any kind of majoritarian melody or well-known song or anything. I was literally trying to listen to how the violin might have wanted to move in the space and play different types of shapes and textures and resonances and sounds that you could never put together and say that made any sense in a majoritarian way, but it probably sounded awful, but it moved us all to do different things. And so the boy is off camera, but his sock puppet is moving in such an energetic and vibrant way. It was very visceral and very vital that both his parent, who eventually came back on the camera, and myself were very, very moved. And I found myself really torn between wanting to let the violin continue and allow this dance, this movement, to engage itself in whatever forces and intensities were happening around it, and wanting to watch and take it in and not be the player. You know, I wanted to just soak it all in, because it was the force was so overwhelming. And the parent said she found the same as well. And it was just, for me, it was just a tiny moment of that incredible absorption in that state of nonsense that made absolute sense with our bodies, where words didn't appear, there was no connection or pattern or regularity to it. But it's really going back to what Joanne was saying about how do we allow that space that decenters the human and perhaps draws in all of the different forces and vitalities that are maybe creating some of the relationship in that particular instance. So for me, that felt very much an example of that interaction without even really trying. And so going back to something that I wrote earlier in the chat, you know, this idea of responsibility really concerns me, because I kind of think, well, how can we take responsibility seriously when our choices are not our own? They're full of history, of the future, of so many aspects of interaction, that maybe it's not about I mean, people talk about survival of the fittest. Maybe it's not that, but it's about survival of the most able to respond, the most responsive, and that's what we're working with here. So we can never have everything or know everything or be everything, but we can maybe respond and difficultate responses through those disturbances as well. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Ruth. I know there's always, well, we know this happens. We've got 3 minutes left, and I'm just going to say a big thank you to the three, because you've already prepared, but maybe I could just ask the 2 questions that we haven't asked or aired today, but maybe Mari, and in 1 minute, and maybe Anna in 1 minute, and maybe Ruth in 1 minute, you could just share either how your research questions change, if you'd like to, or maybe a comment about supervision. And it's not the end of this conversation, because we're going to start reading your work. But yeah, Mari, if you don't mind, but we do need to pause this part of our returning.
I can say 2 words about my research question, because I started off wondering about violin teachers' understandings of learning goals, extremely human-centered and constructionist. And already then, before I knew of posthumanism, I knew that I didn't like my question. It really felt wrong and off. And I spent so much time trying to tweak those verbs into something more suitable. And I spent almost 5 years on my PhD, and I think 2 of them was in a state of refusing to have questions at all, because I found them so limiting. And I tried a million different versions, and I ended up asking, how are violin lessons enacted and what do they produce? And of course it was good enough, but I'm still not happy about that question. And I think that looking for the right questions, or not the right questions, but the other questions, is maybe the most interesting part of doing research.
I love that. Yeah, the other questions. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mari. Anna, do you want to just either talk about how your research questions changed? Would you like to do that as your final comment?
Thank you. So that's really hard, because at the moment, my research question is completely up in the air, research title, that is. And I think it is because of supervision. And if you are, as we mentioned at the start of this conversation, well, not start the conversation today, I am on my own in my institution. And if I was thinking about research the way that I think about it now and the world, I wouldn't have necessarily chosen that institution. And I think a lot of the issues that I'm having with drawing together my thesis in the final stages, when I've written so much, but I can't seem to, like you said, Mari, something feels off, because if I express it in the traditional way, then it doesn't fit. But also the research doesn't fit anywhere, because I haven't, the journey to, I think I described my interest in the posts as burgeoning, and because I do see myself going that way more committedly. But at the moment, I'm still really stuck with what my project was sort of funded to do, which was to, work within these really humanistic systems. So I think what would work for supervisions would be to have our supervisors give us the trust and the benefit of the doubt that Mari's had from hers, if we haven't got the supervisors who are sort of experts, quote unquote, in the field. And I think it would be great if, again, something we've talked about today, about how one of the generative things of the pandemic, amongst all the non-generative and reductive things, was that we have been able to sort of open out our conversations more internationally, more easily. And I think that if we were able to have supervision teams cross-institutional, internationally, I think that would be really generative for the PhD student, particularly because post-qualitative research seems to be so, you know, prevalent in other countries outside the UK, although obviously brilliant in the UK, but just not everywhere.
Thanks, Anna. And then thank you everyone for staying. And maybe we could just ask for one more minute. Ruth, if you'd like to make one comment in a minute, and I can stop you and then we'll say thanks.
No problem. Thank you so much. I would like to make a comment about my supervision team, and I have to give credit to Christina McRae, who's now my first supervisor, and Laura Traffy-Pratts, who's my second supervisor, both of whom, circling right back to the beginning, have offered the trust that Mari was talking about and really enabled me to think very much outside of my own comfort zones, and they have actively participated in that discomforting scenario and tried to understand how we can make spaces for our own intellectual and bodily struggles to make palpable and articulable what is continuously dismissed as not legible, if you like, by ableist patterns in the house of modernity. And I go back to what I was saying before about Manning's notion of minor sociality, which refers to a mode of neurodiverse sociality that lives and expresses in excess to what white rational liberalism establishes as normative. And so rather, in a bid for accountability between the three of us in our oddkin relations, because we're all very different, we've aimed to approximate how, as Manning says, neurodiversity's power is to feel the blur, the ambiguity and the fugitivity. She says that in Pragmatics of the Useless, 2020. So yeah, we really value the differences in our situated trajectories, and we don't try to blend or sort of find a way of merging our different practices, but we're trying to be in reciprocity in the middle of those tensions and those connections. And I feel very, very lucky indeed to be in the middle of all of that with my partners in crime. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I just say a very big thank you to Mari, to Anna, and to Ruth. Just we could give them all a round of applause. Thanks everyone. I mean, for just maybe ending with Farad reminds us that returning is a troubling matter, and I think we're grateful for this opportunity to be troubled together. That's what a lot of what this conversation has been. So thank you to all of you. George, thank you for recording the session and for putting it up. There's some really interesting things happening in the chat, and some books and some other ideas that we'll be able to keep learning from. So thanks everyone, and hopefully we'll see.
Just a quick reminder of next month. We have not a returning to PhD work by PhD researchers or just graduated ones, but next month we focus on the work of Candice Kubi, who of course very much in literacy education, but also as a lecturer of Postqual research method courses. And so in the reading group we will be reading her work every week. And then at the end of the month, we have a session like this. So we hope to see you again for that. And I also realized I've invited a respondent to Candice Kubi, and she hasn't responded yet to that. So maybe I sent it to the wrong email address. I'm going to check this now. So anyway, thank you again. Take care. And thank you, Rose-Anne, for difficultating this beautifully. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Take care.